Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. We have 45 minutes, a little less 40 minutes. I've been a professor half of my career. I've been an entrepreneur, venture capitalist, angel investor, and for the last 5 years, for want of a better word, economic therapist of cities. So I'm happy to talk about anything that you want to talk about within my realm of expertise, which is pretty broad, but I don't know anything about politics. There are a lot of things I don't know about. And of course, the book as well. So, since I've taught half of my career, I can talk forever. Please interrupt and make comments, questions. I'll tell you if I want to get through a few slides first, and we'll just keep it very informal. Is that okay? And I know I've talked with a couple of you just very briefly. I know some of you identify yourselves as entrepreneurs, and that's great. So I just start with a few calls to action. What I want to get out of these 40 minutes. First of all, I'd love for you to communicate about Worthless, the Worthless book. It actually has a hashtag, the Worthless book. So beyond the stories, there is, and we can talk about my personal experience writing the book, because I wrote it in 6 months. Actually, I wrote it in 30 years and then 6 months. And it's the first 30 years that really make the difference. I think it's perhaps the only real, coherent, consistent definition or framing of the phenomenon of entrepreneurship that's been done in the last couple hundred years. Certainly the last 100 years. And so I want you to communicate about the last 4 chapters of the book in particular. Almost no one gets there. So start at the end. All good students know that you should start with the exhibits and read backwards, because you're going to get asked about the last pages. And then follow me, and I have a newsletter. Write to me. It's actually a good newsletter. It's very user-friendly in the sense that you can opt out any time. It doesn't go out very often unless I feel like that there's really something to say, but I do a lot of writing in the Harvard Business Review. I've done probably 20 or 25 blog articles and about 5 full-length articles in addition to the book. Third call to action, hope we get to it. I've created something, it's now gone semi-viral. It's called the Scale Up Declaration, and the intention is that in a couple of weeks during Global Entrepreneurship Week, people will actually read the Scale Up Declaration and talk about it. And the reason I wrote it, it won't surprise a lot of people in this room, but I go around the world, I do work in this field all over the place, and it's phenomenal to me how confused people like me have made people like you. We have completely reversed the dialogue of entrepreneurship. The story of entrepreneurship now in the dialogue begins with registering a company. Those of you who know, I mean, I'm sure you've all registered companies. I've registered 3 in the last 4 years. That counts as a company created, and all the statistics and all the research that's done on entrepreneurship, that's called entrepreneurship. So the startup tail have been wagging the dog. That's the tail. The tail of registering a business is actually meaningless economically. And I'll show you some data if we get to it, that it's actually inversely correlated with economic development and growth. And what's been taken out of the dialogue, which is the dog, is growth. And again, because you won't hear me say, well, I'll get to this in a few minutes, because you don't have it in a few minutes, I'll get to it right now. There's no entrepreneurship without growth. There is no entrepreneurship without the aspiration and the drive to growth. In the way that I've defined it, and you refer to it as creating value, that's part of the puzzle, and it's creating economic value. We can talk and we can debate. There are very smart people who don't agree with me. Fortunately, I'm right and they're wrong, but it's still legitimate to have discussions about these things. And hopefully people will read the Scale Up Declaration, which puts the dog in front of the tail. It starts the dialogue with growth and ends the dialogue with startup. Again, we can talk about why that's important. And then finally, if you know anything about any cities or regions that need economic, actually our band, we have projects in Milwaukee, Scale Up Milwaukee, a project in Manizales, Colombia. The latter is actually revolutionizing a 500,000 person city in Colombia. It's become the leading economic development project in Latin America, and probably one in the world. It's now serving as a model, believe it or not Silicon Valley, but actually serving a model for a whole new project called Scale Up UK, that's starting a broad-based multi-stakeholder project in the UK that's been launched November 17th. So actually we are changing the dialogue. And I wouldn't have said that 6 months ago. Today I can say with confidence, we're actually changing the dialogue in entrepreneurship to begin with the process of scale and then get to the whole issue of start. But that's all based on showing how cities can grow in just a few years. When you get it right, when you get the story right, and have a few good ideas and a few good methodologies and execute like crazy, perfect execution, you can actually change the economic fate of a metro region in 3 to 5 years. But you have to get it right. Let me start off. I want to go back to what you said about entrepreneurship, and it's become a buzzword. And I believe that it's called the pragmatic view of language. Is that languages are tools, and words are tools, and you only know whether they're wordy if they're useful to do something. If you can do something with them. And the problem with such a broad definition of entrepreneurship is it's gotten so broad, like innovation and a few other things, that we can't do anything useful with it. So we've got to get back to a narrow definition of entrepreneurship in order for it to be useful at doing something. So let's start with a tale of two people, one of whom you may recognize, not too far from home. The other one I'm sure you do not recognize. And just tell you quickly and ask you a question about entrepreneurship based on these two people. Of course, Dean Kamen was a very successful inventor, commercialized many of his inventions, portable kidney dialysis machine, that thing that climbs upstairs. And then in 1999, a buzz spread around. You look too young to remember this, but a buzz spread around Boston and Silicon Valley saying, there's this guy who's totally revolutionizing personal transportation. And no one knows what it is, what it does, and he got John Doerr, the famous venture capitalist John Doerr, and he got Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos, and he got our own Bill Solomon from the Harvard Business School to come out, look at it, invest money. I don't know if Bill invested, but invest money, and they said all these things about it. New human transporter, billion-dollar industry, bigger than the internet, John Doerr. By the way, there's one of my recent tweets, I retweeted a friend of mine, professor at Harvard, Clestis Jum, I retweeted the 8 technology forecasts that were totally failed, like Bill Gates saying that they will never do social media and that sort of thing. And then the institutions came in and invested. I'm being brief and a little bit superficial. After a few years, it was labeled as one of the 10 biggest technology failures. Dean Kamen was thrown out as CEO of Segway. Of course, you recognize now we're talking about Segway. They wouldn't even tell people the name of it. That's, I guess, how you raise money when you're Dean Kamen. But when you can, I mean, I'm not saying that at all disparagingly. It was sold to UK entrepreneur Irish Jimmy Heselton, who was found dead at the bottom of a cliff with his Segway next to him. In 2011, nobody knows. But then it was sort of, the last we heard of Segway is that it was bought by this private equity group in southeastern United States that had gotten together to reposition. And I've been an venture capitalist. And investors, how many of you do some angel investing? If you really want to make money, you have to do a little forensic. I call it forensic investing. You have to, when people are lying to you or saying, we grew by 300,000%, we grew from 1 to $300,000 in revenue. Sort of learn to ask these questions to get behind the beautiful stories you hear. And there's a beautiful story. They repositioned the assets of Segway. And now you see them in airports, and you see them in cities, the city tours, and so on. But definitely, for sure, the investors who invested in it, with some more, they lost all their money. And from the point of view of invention, it worked phenomenally. It worked, but from the point of view of business, it didn't work. The investors wiped out their money, and it's still unclear. It's now sort of a niche product. Maybe 20 years from now, it'll be a huge success, and it really will revolutionize the human transportation. If anybody does an IRR, probably nobody will. On IRR of the initial investments, they'll be really, 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 really small, if positive at all. And so, you're asking yourselves, and I'm going to ask you, is Dean Kamen an entrepreneur? And to what extent is he an entrepreneur? And now I'm going to show you another example. And usually when I do this, I stop and I let people talk and argue. We don't have time for arguing, except with me. And so I'll just give you another example of a guy, a little bit younger than Dean Kamen, named Robert Westman, Icelandic guy. And in 1999, the same time, He came back from Germany to his home city of Iceland. Anybody here visited? Oh, come on. No? It's a non-stop flight, 5 hours. You have to go. There are two places you have to go, by the way. And they're almost diametric opposites. One is Iceland, I've been there many times, and the other one is the Azore Islands. They both are exactly the same distance, non-stop flight from Boston. One is warmer than you think, and the other one is colder than you think. It's the opposite. And I just got back from the Azores 2 days ago. I am going back. Anybody here been to the? Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? No contradictions and no grievances. So Robert Westman came back to Iceland, found a little 90-person company that had 3 generic drugs. They were doing about 14 million euro in sales. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. 2 weeks, they were going to close the doors and throw away the keys. He came in, convinced the bank to loan him 10 million euro, got some other investments together. Robert Weston, middle-class guy, had experience running operations in Germany. And by the way, when I interviewed, I wrote a case on him, when I interviewed his classmates from high school, said there was no way that we would ever have thought of Robert as the most likely to succeed in our class. This is what happened in 8 years. And if you actually check today, it's even gotten better. That in 5, it became from 90 plus to 11,000 people in 8 years. There are no typos in this. He made 26 successful acquisitions. He became 32, 1.6 billion in revenues, 650 products, activities in 40 markets, 650 pills that they were selling. This is generic pharmaceuticals. Actavis is now the 2nd largest generic pharmaceutical company in the world. Now, the other one, by the way, Teva, being an Israeli company. And over time, he mortgaged his house, invested more money, took loans, invested more money, and so on and so forth. So that's, and by the way, so you look at any notions, any Schumpeterian notions in your minds about innovation here, the business model he used was not innovative. There was nothing innovation, of course, and you know generic pharmaceuticals. It's the antithesis of innovators. It's the antithesis of innovation. You can only call it a generic if all the innovation is sucked out of it. By definition, it has to be exactly the same. Otherwise, you won't get approval. It has to be exactly the same as the innovative drug that it copied and went off patent. Exactly the same. If there's any innovation, you may be breaking the law. You may actually go to jail if there's any innovation in it. And there's no innovation in the business model. The playbook, everybody in the industry knew the playbook of what's to be successful. He executed better than anybody else, at least better than his competitors. And by the way, he left in 2009, founded a second, he didn't buy this company, he founded the second called Alvogen. He told me the other day that from a start in 2009, closing this year in 2014, they'll close on 650 million euro in sales, and they'll do $1 billion next year. Standing start, 5 years. So, who's the entrepreneur?
Don't be shy.
You only get graded. Who's the entrepreneur here?
They both are, but to
Why?
different scales, because they both created jobs and companies. One is much more successful than the other.
You agree with that? They both are?
No.
So your definition of entrepreneurship is creating jobs?
Creating companies.
Creating companies.
And, well, companies with jobs.
So it doesn't matter if the company succeeds or fails. It doesn't matter if shareholders lose value or gain value.
Well,
It doesn't matter if the product doesn't succeed in the market.
as an
It does.
entrepreneur, yes, that's right, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Do you agree with that? It says it doesn't matter if you make money, doesn't matter if you get into the market. All that matters is that what? You create jobs.
No, you try to, using your word vernacular, to scale your
So
idea.
you try. So it's about effort. So entrepreneurs get an A for effort. I'm
Hopefully.
picking on this guy, just the nicest guy in the room. And so I'm picking on him. You don't have time for me to pick on everybody. You know, I'm picking on 2 or 3 people.
But for every successful, what's his name again?
Robert Westman.
Westman. can you find 9 or 99 people who come into an industry without an innovative idea, want to scale, borrow, find somebody to lend the money, and fail? I think, yeah, you find a lot of those are entrepreneurs. They're not successful entrepreneurs, but they're entrepreneurs.
So Robert Westman is a good entrepreneur. Dean Kamen, at least in this example, is a bad entrepreneur.
Yeah, it's hard to define it.
Could he have been a good entrepreneur and become a bad entrepreneur? If he commercialized, made a lot of money and jobs and so on through his kidney dialysis machine or through the wheelchair that actually climbs upstairs. If you've seen it, it's amazing things. You know, there are YouTube things. You know, it goes up, up, up. What could he be a good entrepreneur one day and been a bad entrepreneur the next day or next year? Is entrepreneurship a person, or is it an act? Is it a role that people play? I have a PhD in psychology. I have a license, actually, to ask those kinds of questions.
So I would consider Dean a great inventor, but not a good entrepreneur.
Do you agree with that?
Yes.
So he says, he's a great inventor. There's no question about that. But he actually made money out of, where did he get the 50, so he put 50 million of it. No one knows exactly. The estimates are, there's a book called Codenamed Ginger about this. He actually invested about 50 million, maybe 100 of his own personal cash in this. It worked, and he's in this, and he got that cash from the other inventions that actually built companies around. Do you still think he's an inventor? In addition to that, is he anything else? Was he anything else?
He was still an entrepreneur, but he wasn't as successful. So I think,
was he more successful in selling $100 million of kidney dialysis machines that he invented, or raising $350 million in venture capital, building a Segway, and losing all of his investors' money? Which was more successful entrepreneurship?
Kidney dialysis. Kidney dialysis.
But according to what you were saying, that would not be the exam. That would not be the conclusion. Okay, let's go on. I'm just keeping you awake. What's fascinating about this discussion is that none of you, I'm almost sure, has really ever sat down and thought what entrepreneurship is. Really thought. And including, until this book was written, almost no books considered it. They just said, all the books just say, whatever entrepreneurs, everyone should be one. Which, by the way, if you agree with the notion that it's at least an attempt, a striving to scale, a striving to growth, that notion that everyone should be an entrepreneur is patently silly. And the one person I've ever heard call the line that says a serial entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, Scott Painter, I don't know if you've heard of him. He had a conference at the World Economic Forum, said, I don't want my employees to be entrepreneurs. I'm the entrepreneur. You can actually see that if you believe that entrepreneurship is growth, if you have an imaginary closed economic system, let's say of 10 people, starting a company and being an entrepreneur are actually antithetical to each other. Because if 10 people start those companies, none of them will grow if everyone's an entrepreneur. If one's an entrepreneur, that's all you can handle, because that person will hire the other 9 and start to grow. That's why real entrepreneurs, when you ask them all over the world, they say 3 things. 3 things. By the way, if you Google the term entrepreneurship ecosystem, you'll come to my work. All of the top hits. I am guilty of that piece of jargon. But I've looked and studied and intervened in, more to the point, entrepreneurship areas, regions, all over the world, in all kinds of economies, and everywhere they say exactly the same thing. What's missing for you? Number 1 is talent. By far the first gap or need that entrepreneurs have is that good, hireable talent. And then somewhere in there is capital, and somewhere in there is government bureaucracy. Those are the 3 things everywhere, no matter where you survey. Sometimes capital gets a little bit on top, but that's only when you talk to people in startups who don't have any sales and may not ever have any. So, what is entrepreneurship? You can see from these examples what it isn't. Robert Westman, and I'm sure some of you, and by the way, a lot of what I'm saying I think is just common sense. Only problem is that people like myself have twisted that common sense of the world. Have you recovered from the fact that I've been picking on you?
So I've
hope so.
had professors from Israel before, and you didn't throw anything at me. So.
Not, you don't have time for me to throw things at you. But do you have Josh Lerner in class?
I didn't take a course, but I know.
Okay, Josh throws things, not from Israel. I would be careful of that spurious correlation. From Israel, we have other ways of dealing with people. So if you take these examples seriously, and if you do say, if you scratch your head, no one said here, oh, Robert Westman's not an entrepreneur. I've heard this said. He's not an entrepreneur. He's just a good businessman. You know, from 99 to 11,000 in 8 years. Okay, just a good businessman. Created €3 billion of value for his shareholders from negative equity. Okay, maybe he's just a good businessman, but most people, 75, 80% of the people I talk to say they're both, Robert Westman is a successful entrepreneur. Dean Kamen was a successful entrepreneur, had been, and some people debate whether or not in Segway he was really an entrepreneur or not. One of the questions I ask in my book is, do entrepreneurs get an A for effort? And my conclusion is probably not. Probably not. So first of all, they're not just startups. You cannot conflate entrepreneurship with startups. Robert Westman, he actually bought into a company, and you know examples of people, and maybe you've done it yourself, actually acquired companies. Does that make you less of an entrepreneur? People have acquired brands. They spin out divisions. They repurpose assets. In fact, what they usually do is repurpose assets that other people devalue, that others do things or buy things that other people think are worthless and turn them into value. So you can't equate them with startups, in particular because the vast majority of new business registrations, and believe me, that when anybody, any economist and any politician starts to measure startups, even though they say, no, a startup is not just registering a business, it's a business that's gonna grow. But when they measure it, when they count it, when they do research on the numbers of companies that are registered. Period. That's the proxy, the economic proxy for entrepreneurship. If you register, I don't know how many of you registered a company. I did a few weeks ago. I registered a company. My son and I are buying an apartment in Panama. I wanted some tax advantages. We registered a company. It took 15 minutes. We said, okay. So it's, you know, if someone like Scott Walker today, who's running for election in Wisconsin, said, under my watch, we've created 25,000 new businesses. And there's a newspaper that has this truth-false barometer, Journal Sentinel, and they analyzed that statement and analyzed the 25,000 new businesses. And of course, most of them were LLCs. Some of them are owned by people all over the world who wanted to also buy apartments or other kinds of assets. So that doesn't work. They can't be startups, despite the fact that the Kauffman Foundation, and some of you have probably heard of the Kauffman Foundation, they explicitly say that entrepreneurship is the creation of startups. The opinion leader in the world says that entrepreneurship is the creation of startups. It's not technology. Robert Westman didn't take technology. He succeeded as an entrepreneur based on execution. And it certainly isn't innovation. It doesn't mean that entrepreneurs can't be innovative, but it's not the same as innovation. And you started to talk about, well, what's invention and you didn't get to innovation, but they are different things. If we believe that Robert Westman was an entrepreneur, taking something completely uninnovative. And also I had an argument with the Kauffman Foundation about this because they say, but anything that grows is by definition innovative. I said, well, if you say that, then you can't say that innovation drives growth. Because you say that innovation is growth. I think it's arguable that we need a word for something other than growth that reflects novelty and recombination of things in new ways. And it's not equivalent to self-employment. I'll show you, I don't know if you can see this better. This is a recent representation of some data by Gallup, which shows the relationship around the world between GDP per capita and number of startups, or number of self-employed companies, number of companies that are owned run by the owners. It's a perfect correlation. correlation, and the only problem is that it's negative. There's a perfectly negative correlation between the number of startups and economic growth, or economic health. And by the way, you can do the same study within the United States, and you see exactly the same thing. Venture capital, perfectly correlated with the number of startups, only it's negative. The more venture capital there is in a region, the fewer startups there are. The fewer new companies registered there are. It's not a numbers game. I know you're looking very, very puzzled. These are just data. And by the way, if you look at the United States, there's also a perfectly negative correlation with only one aberration, perfectly negative correlation between small business friendliness and the amount of venture capital. Perfectly negative. The worst places in the United States to do business are Massachusetts, New York, and California. They're in the bottom 10% of all the surveys in all the years. We don't know crap about what entrepreneurship is. Well, we do know crap. That's exactly what we know. So, just a couple of quick comments, and I just threw some slides together and I have 15 more minutes. What entrepreneurship is? Well, I think if you push, we won't have time, that these 8 words, in fact, one of them is extraneous, but I just had to put it in there. How contrarian entrepreneurs, you can cross out the word contrarian, entrepreneurs create and capture extraordinary value. That is a necessary and sufficient conceptualization, I think, definition of what entrepreneurship is. And if you cross out contrarian and put in economic value, that also is sufficient, and in fact, I think it's the only definition that, given all the data and all the reasoning and all the concepts about entrepreneurship, the only one that works. So it's more about growth than start. Actually, look at the research all over the world on high growth firms. You know what, I'm going to get to the last slide here. It'll be easier. All the research on high growth firms shows that they tend to be between 15 and 30 years old. They're a very, very small number of 1 to 2 to 3% of something, depending on how you look at the denominator. So they're rare. They tend to be in the basic industries. In fact, it's just a few percentage that are what we would call technology, even though I don't think there's a very valid distinction we can make today between technology and non-technology. Real estate is very, development has a lot of technology. Diamond trade has a lot of technology in it. Anybody, insurance, bought insurance recently? Lots of technology in insurance and so on. So I don't know. But it's in the so-called basic industries, food, retail, logistics, manufacturing, a small percentage in what we call ICT and life sciences, despite the fact that every state in the United States and every country in the world is investing their resources because they know that they're going to become the hub of life sciences in the world, or in the United States, and they're going to become the hub of ICT in the United States or in the world. And that's how they're going to grow. Only the problem is there's no evidence for it. Don't bother me with evidence. We don't need that.
Has technology and life sciences built the Boston economy?
You can look at, absolutely. But that's not because someone said 40 years ago, we're going to build an economy around life sciences. It's because we had Harvard and MIT and great hospitals and all those things. And a little bit later, actually, they began to think about the life sciences hub or cluster in Worcester and in Boston and so on and so forth. That was very much after the fact. So you can, of course, you can see concentrations of these things. Israel has tremendous amounts of information technology entrepreneurship. But it wasn't because the government set some policy that said we're going to be the world's hub in ICT. It was because of lots of reasons, and we really don't have time for this. And actually, that is something I do know a fair amount about because I was part of that. A lot of it was just because of security. The government, for some strange reason, prioritized security, and as a result, there was a spillover. There was huge amounts, a flood of free technology available that had been developed in the military, but not only in the military. Yeah, so you do see these concentrations. But as policy, the intention to create economic growth through these things has been largely a failure.
Can you touch on the last item on
Yes.
the sporadic?
Yes, sporadic. So what's interesting, when you do research and you look at high growth firms, and a number of studies have showed this, and by the way, I'll confess, the number of studies that I'm talking about, it's much more like paleontology than what you think of, lab science. We're talking about a natural phenomenon. You find the jawbone and you sort of reimagine the whole dinosaur. We have little bits of data, little pieces, and we try to construct the whole picture from that. So I'll tell you the little pieces of data, and I can explain how we get from that to the whole monster. But I want to be clear, and I want to be honest with you, that these are based on very pieces of data here and there, but consistent. And that is that growth doesn't, in general, start with a startup, 5 years later grow up. Let's say 99 die on the way, like chickens thrown across a super highway. 99 get smacked. One makes it through, and that's a scale up. And that one grows to be a super chicken. That's not how it usually works. It usually works, they call them trigger events, that when you look at how growth happens, it happens sporadically. A 20, 30-year-old firm, Legal Seafood's a good example in the local area. The second generation Berkovits take it over. They go to Harvard Business School or MIT or wherever they go to learn. They get ambition. They say, let's, we got something here. The brand's good. It works well in the square, even though somebody burned it down. Let's go make a few of them in the Boston. And then let's go make a few around the world. Now there's Legal Seafoods all around the United States. That's a scale up. That's how it typically happens. There's a crisis, generation change, the market, the competitive dynamics change, and then a company that was like this goes, phew. And by the way, in our work in ecosystems, we find that we can actually create those trigger events. And that's one of the keys to the rapid growth, is when there are 100 companies with 2, 3, 4, 5, $10 million in revenues, 20% of them, 15 to 20% of them, actually with a little bit of help, can enter into an inflection point. It doesn't have to be completely sporadic. I realize I'm skipping over things that each one of these could be a seminar in and of itself. So, just a few random slides I put together, because I've been looking at this from the civic or policymaker perspective over the last 6 years as we've intervened in cities and regions. One of the things that you hear about now is accelerate. Policymakers and some of you with your civic hats on, and some of us with our civic hats on, we love these things. We love to reify processes. And so we had clusters. And largely as a strategy, it's a descriptive fact. It's absolutely true. There are such things as clusters. As a prescriptive policy, it's much, much, much more complicated than that. So we had clusters. And all over the world, there are cluster strategies. Now we have accelerators for entrepreneurship specifically. Someone did some research last year of 120 of the accelerators and found that if you took out Y Combinator, one accelerator, then almost all the value of accelerators disappears. In 10 years, it may look different. Techstars may burst through, maybe a couple of others, but it's a very, 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 very small number. So it's not a model, it's a phenomenon. Just a quick, again, I'm just throwing this in. I've been studying for the last few weeks because I've been giving a series of workshops to large companies, trying to understand if there's a rationale for them to engage with entrepreneurs, make acquisitions, do technology partnering, supply chain development, talent act, whatever it is. Turns out it's actually very, very hard to build an argument for large companies to systematically engage with entrepreneurs. It's possible, but it's hard. So I looked at a whole range of examples of partnerships of various kinds between entrepreneurial firms and large companies. First, the large company, their pipe dream is, I'm going to be Google, I'm going to buy, which worked for Google? YouTube, right, and that's probably the main one, is YouTube and maybe applied semantics, which became the basis of AdSense and created a platform. And YouTube, although it's kind of a little bit on the side of Google, is now quite profitable. But And then, okay, and then Apple and Sound Jam, that created the basis of iTunes. And there are a few others, but after those few, it's very, very hard to find examples of companies that have really changed their survival, their strategy, their competitiveness because of engagement with entrepreneurs. They're there. They're just hard to find. Let me just skip over all this. Say a couple words about the Scale Up Declaration. This is a very simple set of statements that I wrote with Desh Deshpande and Linda Rotenberg, if anybody knows her, the chair of Endeavor, and Sherry Kutu, who's on the board of LinkedIn, and she's a member of the board of the Stock Exchange in the UK, and Fernando Fabre of Endeavor wrote the Scale Up Declaration to try and impact the dialogue. I'd love for you to go to our website. I don't know if you can see this.
Dan, I'll send out a link to everybody.
Okay, great. And basically, it's a 9-bullet point that is going to be read by the Prime Minister, to the President of France, the Prime Minister of Denmark, the Crown Prince of Bahrain. They're going to be read out loud. They're going to do some of the reading themselves. It's going to be discussed. Again, it's a way of trying to reverse the dialogue so that it starts with scale, it starts with growth, and then goes back into startup. And it talks about why entrepreneurship of the kind that I'm talking about, growth entrepreneurship, why that's been a very fundamental driver of not just economic, but also social value, and what does it take to make that growth the center point of the dialogue. And then I mentioned the word entrepreneurship ecosystem. This has been copied tens of thousands of times around the world. Very simple language for describing what we mean when we talk about an environment that's conducive to entrepreneurship. Because you can see, you're absolutely right, you can see places in which there are concentrations of high growth entrepreneurship, whether it's Iceland or Israel or parts of Ireland, or whether it's certain districts within Mexico City, or wherever it is, you can see these concentrations. And the question is, why does this happen? How does it happen? And can we do it intentionally? What happens naturally in 40 or 50 years, is there any way that we can do this intentionally in 5 years? And I think.
Dan, can you, I know we're.
Yes.
We have
Well,
a
let's
little
just-
time. No, but can you
stop.
spend a few minutes talking about some of your recent work with some of these cities, and what are the, because you made a very provocative statement at the beginning of your presentation, that with the right set of circumstances and the right situation.
The right ideas.
Right, you can turn around an economy in 3 to 5 years.
There's some evidence for that. And there's actual evidence for that.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
That's pretty fascinating to me.
So there's a, okay, in 3 minutes I'll tell you that.
How about a teaser for the next time?
So the teaser is that here's the teaser. Don't think about countries, think about concentrated metro regions of 500,000 people and above. That's number one. Number two, think about that it's a multi-stakeholder activity. Nobody owns an entrepreneurship. And ecosystems are not owned. By definition, they sort of happen. And the parts are mutually reinforcing. So you've got to get representatives of those parts together. You've got to get them aligned around what entrepreneurship is and isn't. That's not about self-employment. It's not about startups. It's about growing companies. That's the heart of the entrepreneurship dialogue. That's hard because we filled their heads with so much confusion. You have to get them aligned, and you have to, within 6 to 9, let's say 12 months, actually conduct programs, pilot programs, that demonstrate that you can see growth happening. In very small bits, that you can see growth happening. If you take companies where the market's already voted, you don't talk about startups, because most of them we know aren't even created to grow. Those few startups that are created with an intention to grow, only a few of those actually do grow. We'd start by letting nature have to take care of that. The companies that somehow have made it through, the 15 or 20% of those 1, 2, 5, $10 million companies that actually have the ambition, if only they knew how, and if only they saw the inspirational role models, they already know how to sell what a customer is. They already know what invoicing is. They already know how to hire people. They already know that it's not as easy as they read about in the newspaper. They already know a whole lot of things. There's a very few things that they don't know, and we can teach them those things in weeks. So I'll give you just, so you don't think I'm totally nuts, I'll give you just a quick example. Most people like that don't know that you can go over your list of rejects, all the customers who said no, and you can have a conversation with them. Most people like that think that once they say no, it means no. We can teach them within weeks to go back and have a different conversation and convert 10 to 20% of those into immediate sales by having a different kind of talk, by listening. So this is all stuff that most of you know, but a lot of people in the world don't know that. Once people see that, and once the stakeholders see that growth can happen within weeks and months, it changes, everything changes. And once that growth becomes systematized, and we know how to systematize that growth, by the way, it's three things. It's very simple. And I'm oversimplifying, but it's all about, first of all, sales organization, and sales management, which you can't teach the startups because they don't have products yet. So sales organization, sales management, compensation, a little bit of marketing, human resources. The other thing that almost every entrepreneur will say, oh, no, that's bureaucracy. Well, I'll worry about that later. Right now, we have to get things going. We have to have an MVP. We have to get to inflection points and so on. And they don't build a human resource platform. And so we teach them how to do that. And that's actually, the basics are actually fairly easy to teach them. And then third has to do with the relationship between finance and operations, and not how to raise money from venture capitalists and angel investors, because most of these environments, they don't exist. It's how do you talk to bankers? How do you talk to public funding agencies? And again, so financing can, when you teach the right things and you have the right idea, it can happen relatively quickly. Then you systematize that. The stakeholders begin to learn that it's possible, and then we scale. And I'm giving you a 3-minute version. This is not a very, very short elevator pitch. It's a short elevator. But it really is economic therapy for cities. And the evidence in Manizales is that it works. The jobs are being created very efficiently. The self-perception of what's possible of all the entrepreneurs in the city and aspiring entrepreneurs